Well, now when we move on to the plan part of the program, at this point, Cannon was going to hand off to me, and I was going to introduce Nathan Stock. Nathan is from the Carter Center, and he is a political violence and mitigation manager. And as we all know, the Carter Center has been monitoring elections for over 30 years, and they've covered more than 113 elections in 39 countries, many of them deeply, deeply divided. So in September 2020, the Carter Center created a new program to focus on domestic political violence mitigation. And it's designed to mitigate violence in select U.S. communities surrounding our November elections. It's pretty sobering work to hear what they've been doing and why they've been doing it. So since we had world-class experience here in our own backyard, we asked Nathan Stock to explain the lessons learned they've at the Carter Center and the work that they've done around the world, and really how it applies to us here in the United States. Nathan Stock has spent more than 20 years working to strengthen democratic elections and resolve political conflicts all over the world. His conflict resolution affiliation with the Carter Center began in 2008, where he served as the assistant director to the international version of the program. He also served as Carter Center's field office director in Jerusalem for Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. He's also been deeply involved in the Syrian civil war and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In fact, before coming to the Carter Center, he worked for a USAID-funded civil society strengthening project based in Kabul, Afghanistan. The man has been around a lot of civil wars and a lot of political disagreements. Nathan currently teaches courses on political dialogue as an adjunct professor at Furman University, and he's also still a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, where he continues to publish on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nathan earned a bachelor's degree in international relations at Colgate University and a master's in international peace and conflict resolution at American University in Washington, D.C. Nathan, we welcome you to the stage and thank you for being here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have your expertise. And so why don't we do this? Why don't we spend about 20, 25 minutes talking about your projects and your experiences, and then I'll come back on and we'll field questions from the audience and a couple of questions that I have.
Sounds good.
Does that work? Good.
Yeah. So thank you again for the introduction. It's great to be with you today. As Bill noted, I spent 9 years working on Middle East conflict with the Carter Center. Most recently, after several years living in small town South Carolina, I just finished a 5-month project where the Carter Center was able to experiment with applying some of the methodologies we use on armed conflicts abroad to address the threat of political violence around the recent U.S. elections. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk briefly about 3 things. I want to share a few thoughts about trends, both national and global, that have been upending politics in the United States and challenging many of the world's democracies. I'll share a bit about the recent Carter Center project I led, and I'll close with some thoughts about what all of you can do to help us ensure that the next election is less volatile than the one we just made it through. But first, I want to talk about some of the bigger issues at stake here. I will never forget a conversation that I had in Damascus on Carter Center business months before the Syrian civil war broke out. I was speaking to a senior Syrian government official, and somehow the conversation shifted to developments in neighboring Iraq. And this Syrian minister tisk-tissed. She made it clear that she looked down her nose at the years of civil war and violence racking Iraq. But of course, less than a year later, a civil war had unfolded in Syria. It wasn't just civil wars that Syria and Iraq had in common. Both countries had a leadership class that was a minority. In the case of Iraq, you had a Sunni Muslim dictatorship. Sunni Muslims were a minority in Iraq. That government was overthrown by the United States in 2003, and it was Iraqi Sunnis that largely led the subsequent insurgency against U.S. forces and against the Shiite Iraqi government. The situation in Syria was a little different. There, the ruling Assad regime hails from a small Muslim minority called Alawites. And the Alawites in the Syrian civil war found themselves facing an uprising from majority Syrian Sunni Muslims and others. So to frame this a little bit, I want to introduce just a little bit of the academic literature around these questions. The first one I point to is this book. These authors marshal a mountain of data to look at the forces that cause ethnic or religious groups within a society to rebel. And they highlight the case of groups that have seen their status downgraded. That is, groups that were dominant in a society but have lost that dominance. They note that a sense of unfairly lost entitlement and the lust for revenge tends to fuel these conflict processes. Downgrading, the loss of status, is a particularly salient conflict trigger, and lest one think that this applies only to faraway places like Syria and Iraq, it's also worth looking at the emerging social science literature in the United States about the fear of something called status loss. One example of this work comes to us from Diana Mutz. She's at the University of Pennsylvania. She was digging into this question of whether or not folks who voted for President Trump back in 2016 were motivated by economic anxiety or social and cultural fears, fears of status loss, fears of their place in an America that is less white and for some also less religious than it used to be. And she finds that it was these fears more than anything else that motivated these voters. The last nerdy academic resource I'm going to throw at you for now is the work of this gentleman, Eric Kaufman. He's a Canadian at the University of London. He digs even deeper into this underlying question of immigration and demographic change. And he argues, looking at cases around the world, that it is this fear of demographic change that is driving the populist backlash that is unsettling democracies in much of the world. So I want to put this in context. I am not singling out the United States or the American people for particular criticism. In my experience, it is common to find change challenging. I grew up in a 1 square mile town in upstate New York in the Rust Belt, but went on to spend years of my life immersed in cultures very different from my own. I understand viscerally how challenging it can be to work across cultures. I know how hard it can be to engage with people who are different from you, whether by virtue of language, religion, or cultural norms. Moreover, every Western democracy, to varying degrees, is grappling with challenges similar to those facing the United States today. But while I don't want to single out the US as being unique in this regard, I also do not want to downplay the dangers facing our democracy. In the Carter Center's work on highly divided societies abroad, we use international conflict assessment methodologies to examine the factors that can hold a society together or pull it apart. Among other things, we assess 4 factors. We look at group grievances. We look at a range of contextual questions that can reduce or increase conflict. We look at ideology, and we look at events that might serve as potential conflict triggers. If you apply this analytical lens to the United States in 2021, it is reasonable to assume that further political violence and highly volatile elections are virtually certain. The US now has all the ingredients for this kind of violence. According to Pew, 76% of Americans who voted for former President Trump in 2020 believe he legitimately won re-election, despite all the evidence to the contrary. That equates to 56.4 million Americans. The firm belief that a democratic election was stolen from their preferred candidate has become the animating principle through which a range of pre-existing grievances are being filtered, particularly fears in an America that is becoming less white and less Christian. So grievances, we've got those in spades. Context. You could draw on a range of contextual factors here, but a few stand out to me. First, there's plenty of survey data that demonstrates that trust in institutions in America, from banks to big business to newspapers to Congress, has been declining for years. This doesn't help. Second, Americans increasingly live in partisan media environments. Social media in particular affords space for the incubation of an increasingly separate discourse. On the right in particular, this has become a space that is incubating conspiracy theories while also building a sense of shared identity of a community increasingly under threat. Third contextual factor that jumps out to me is that in America, there are a lot of guns. Ideology. In the Pacific Northwest and in other communities in the US, there is some evidence of growing far-left militancy, but it would appear that so far the number of partisans in that direction is relatively small. On the American right, there is a long-standing white supremacist strain that has been amplified during the Trump administration. There's also a long-running anti-government discourse in the US that's growing more militant. The discourse of the most extreme partisans, especially on the right, which the Carter Center has been tracking through our recent work, is full of talk of violence and war against perceived enemies at home. An obvious example of this is the chatter of people who were arrested in connection to the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. These people saw acts of violence and looting targeting the seat of their own democracy as both necessary and morally justified. This points to a minority of Americans that will see violence as justified for the foreseeable future. And indeed, a recent unclassified report from the Director of National Intelligence makes this very point. Finally, conflict triggers. We can think of quite a few things that can trigger conflict, but the obvious ones which we know are on the calendar will be our upcoming elections, the midterms, and particularly the 2024 presidential election. It is this analysis that prompted the Carter Center to launch our first ever domestically focused conflict and election programming around the 2020 elections. I want to say a little bit about what we did. So our conflict work only started on September 1st, which didn't give us a lot of time. Our first task was to figure out which communities in the US might be at elevated risk of election-related unrest. We believed that by looking at county-by-county patterns of past protest and past violence, we could roughly anticipate which counties around the presidential election might be at greater risk of protest and violence. To do this, we worked with partners at Princeton University, a crack and data analyst. We aggregated a variety of publicly available data sets. We looked at data on police shootings, militia activity. We went back to the 2016 presidential election results by county, demographic info. We pulled all this together. And by early October, this analysis had generated a list of 27 counties that we saw as being at higher risk of unrest around the election. Most of these were smaller, left-leaning cities surrounded by more conservative rural areas. Think of places like Portland, Oregon, or Charlotte, North Carolina. There were also some larger metro areas that made the list, including Dallas and our very own Atlanta. The Carter Center didn't have the resources to work in all 27 locations, so we shared this analysis strategically with other national networks, dialogue organizations, human rights organizations, in the hope that some of them could direct resources to some of the communities we couldn't reach. And then we chose 4 communities for direct interventions. We chose Raleigh, Durham, and Charlotte in North Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Atlanta. By this point, we were 2 or 3 weeks out from the election. We worked very quickly to identify community leaders in these communities, influential figures who would be willing to work with us on this. We pulled together a hodgepodge of clergy, leaders at local nonprofits. We had a former mayor, volunteers with a local dialogue organization. And we brought these stakeholders together in a series of location-specific Zoom workshops. So one for Pittsburgh, one for Raleigh, Durham, etc. And in each of these workshops, we started out by sharing the risk analysis that our data analytical model had generated for the urban center in their community. This is an example of the risk profile that we developed for Fulton County. Now, all this is doing is showing you the factors in our analytical model and then ranking where Fulton County sits as compared to the other counties in our data set. We shared this analysis, but then we asked questions. We wanted to be very careful not to roll into these communities as know-it-all outsiders. We wanted to understand from people who were local, did they share these concerns? And in particular, and most of them did, that's why they wanted to work with us in the first place, but in particular, were there specific constituencies in their communities that they were worried might be targets for violence? Were there actors that might be more likely to engage in violence? We wanted to ensure that there was some general consensus amongst these community stakeholders on the nature of the problem. Then we pivoted to ensuring that these stakeholders were networked, that they had each other's cell phone numbers, that they could be ready on text message chains, so that they could respond quickly and constructively in a de-escalatory fashion in their communities if there were problems around the election. And we shared curated messaging. We started with a list of like 14 talking points that we'd put together. Many of these were messages designed to reinforce confidence in the electoral process. A lot of these were basic facts about how American elections are supposed to work and why they tend to be credible, at least so far. We shared this very generic content, and then we encouraged the local community networks we were forming to customize it, translate it into your local vernacular, frame this in ways that are more likely to be resonant with the people in your community. One example of this process of local translation came from a group of faith leaders that we managed to connect with in the Pittsburgh area. They took the ball and ran with it. They produced a series of social media ready graphics that adapted our generic content. And they released these on a daily schedule up to and after the election. Once we got through the presidential election, with the runoffs looming here in Georgia, we pivoted to focus almost exclusively on the state. But the model of work was basically similar. We focused in particular on convening faith leaders and others in Georgia. And similar to our work before the presidential election, we tried to share analysis of particular violence risk factors, build some consensus on the nature of the problem, and then see if we could mobilize these influential figures with facts and messages that could help to push back against violence. This is an example of some social media content that the Carter Center produced and shared with these local community influencers. But I want to underscore the animating principle, the theory underlying this work was that we could identify influential local community figures and bring them together around constructive messages. And that in turn, those local community leaders could speak to their constituencies with a credibility that we might lack. And in so doing, strengthen confidence in the election and reduce the potential for violence. And we knew from the start that this was a very modest effort. We could only begin to address the deep fissures in American society. Nevertheless, we were encouraged by the response to our efforts. As we've said, the Carter Center had never done work of this nature in the United States. Frankly, we lacked contacts in the vast majority of the communities where we tried to engage. And yet, time and again, total strangers were willing to volunteer their time to work with us on this. This suggests that there is potential to expand this work in the years to come. So this leads me to the last part of my presentation. What can you do? I spent 5 great years living in Atlanta. I am not an expert in the history of the city, but I think I have a sense of the highlights. Atlanta prides itself on being the city that was too busy to hate. This is a city where civic and business leaders work together to get ahead of the curve on desegregation. Leaders in Atlanta opted to prioritize democracy, the right of every American to vote, over racism and Jim Crow. I can't speak to why the white leadership of the city in that era made those decisions. I can't say they were all committed anti-racist in their hearts, but I think it is fair to say that they wanted the trains to run on time. They didn't want protests, they didn't want disruptions, they didn't want violence. They didn't want the reputation of their city to be harmed. Whatever else they felt, they made a decision to prioritize democracy over racism, and in so doing, they chose order over chaos. American society is again at an inflection point in our long struggle to form a more perfect union. Provided we have the resources, the Carter Center is hoping to expand the work I just outlined, not just in Georgia, but in other presidential swing states. Aspects of the approach will be similar to what I've just described. We want to pull together as many civic leaders, business leaders, faith leaders, activists, as many credible community voices as we can, and we want to mobilize these voices to stand up publicly in support of the underlying principles that make democracy work. I'll tell you the same thing I told the dozens of faith leaders that we brought together in Georgia back in December. This is not about politics. We are not in the business of pushing anyone to support any particular candidate. Rather, we will need as many community leaders as possible, on the left, on the right, in the center, to stand up for principles like these. This is an excerpt from a code of conduct that the Carter Center tried to get all 4 Senate candidates to sign off on back in December. Ultimately, the Republican candidates demurred, and our CEO, Page, went on to publish an op-ed around this theme in the AJC. I am sharing this with you because as civic and business leaders, each of you has particular influence. You have the capacity to push for the realization of principles like these. I firmly believe that by being vocal in support of truth in our politics, by standing up for the right to vote for all and pushing back against specious allegations of fraud, by resisting dehumanizing rhetoric and the recourse to violence that so often follows, you can help strengthen the norms and values that make America a democracy. This matters because the future is as yet unwritten, and democracy can still save us. If we can demonstrate through our actions that historically marginalized communities can realize their rights as full and equal citizens, and if we can convince Americans who are fearful of the changes in our country that they still have a place here, if we can keep everyone operating within the basic guardrails of democracy, I believe we can make it through this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And that was fascinating. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's it's a tough message for all of us. Change is hard. We all know change is hard, but let me unpack a couple of things. So, in your work that you went into these communities, first of all, there's this impact of the community that says your community is prone to post-election violence, which is a bit of a whack on the head, if you'll pardon a technical term. So, who steps up? Who looks at you skeptically? What are the types you've seen, and are they similar around the world? Or what did you see in Atlanta in terms of who was willing to step up?
Well, we found, I thought, a significant degree of receptivity to our core message. My sense, talking to regular folks who are not professional conflict analysts, was by the time we got into October, there was a sense of nervousness about the political climate, the vitriol, the tension. And so when we were able to share some analysis with folks about why, say, Charlotte, might stand out as being at risk, it was helpful. And there was a sense from folks who ran anti-poverty organizations, local activists, former elected officials, that they were willing to lend their voices if they thought there was a chance they could influence the environment in a constructive way. I will note that in the short time we had, we were less successful in engaging folks on the right of the aisle with conservative backgrounds. I think those are connections we can make, but it takes time and requires real deliberate trust building. And in the weeks we had, there wasn't really time to do that.
Well, there had to be a bit of a credibility issue. I mean, in one of your interviews, and excuse me for reading, in NPR, you quoted, I think some Americans had just the pervasive beliefs that things couldn't go bad. Yeah, it's tense, and we're arguing a lot more, but America would continue to have peaceful elections. Of course, we wouldn't see people storming the Capitol, and then we did, and so there's this shock and awe, I guess, was my, and the fact that we're talking about it is quite extraordinary. And so I'd really like to understand how you pick the communities and what constitutes a conflict pointed or community. I mean, what are the key factors that people can take back to their businesses and look at and say, hey, we have a whole pound of that.
Yeah. So, the model that we developed in the fall was not perfect. We certainly didn't have a crystal ball that could predict where violence would erupt, and we made no claims to that effect. Nevertheless, there were certain broad patterns that were pretty clear. Smaller left-leaning cities registered as being at highest risk. And keep in mind, this was a model that was looking for politically motivated violence. It is in those smaller urban centers where people of differing politics, particularly hardcore partisans on the two extremes, were more likely to physically interact with one another, right?
Right.
If you're a militia type in the Pacific Northwest, getting into Portland is not too difficult. Whereas, it's worth noting, New York, Chicago, LA didn't register as being at risk in our model. Why is that? Well, geography is a big part of it. It's just harder to have that kind of partisan mixing in these really big metro urban geographies. Similarly, huge rural swaths of the U.S., conservative leaning states also did not register as risk. Now, that doesn't mean you'll never see a protest anywhere in South Carolina, but it suggests that you don't have the same critical mass of opposing partisans in the same places that are more likely to spark protests that could in turn become contentious.
So what would be a critical factor besides proximity? Everybody's angry in New York until you get to New York and you realize they're not angry. That's just the way they are on a normal day-to-day basis. So in a community like you had mentioned, Portland, what were the factors that caused Portland to be such an obvious choice?
Well, Portland so far for the United States is a little bit of a canary in the coal mine. There you have a long history of fairly militant far left activism that goes back to the sort of militant environmental movement decades ago. So you have a real base and infrastructure for that partisan leaning that is quite militant. Oregon and the Pacific Northwest are also states that have an entrenched history of white supremacy. These were states that were founded in some ways as white homelands. So in more rural parts of the state, you have a real entrenched conservatism, including elements of militia movement. You have a lot of towns in Oregon that not so long ago were sundown towns, where persons of color knew that they could incur serious bodily harm should they appear in town after dark. So you've got this unique mix of entrenched partisans on very, very opposite ends of the ideological spectrum that come into contact with one another. What do you do about that? How do you get ahead of that? Well, I mean, this is sort of our theory of the case. I think that it's possible in many American communities to strengthen the middle, to elevate the voices of, I think, the majority of Americans that still want us to have democratic elections, don't want violence in the streets, want the trains to run on time. I think it's possible to elevate those voices in a way that reduces space, reduces the oxygen required to be violent or disruptive. And that's part of what we hope to do, particularly in states that we anticipate are likely to be contentious around future presidential elections.
Yeah. Last question. How does, we're in the big conversation now about legislation that's passing through Georgia at this point. How much does legislation play into your model?
It's going to be a factor. I mean, the legislation moving through the state house and in a number of Republican-dominated state houses right now that may well restrict voting rights. It's going to be a factor. As it regards to Georgia specifically, I would just take a moment to thank folks on this call who are doing their part to try to improve the legislation and ensure that it doesn't infringe on folks' right to vote. But I want to emphasize that we can't lose the forest for the trees here. Unfortunately, the genesis of this legislation in Georgia and many other states is based on a lie that there was this massive fraud in 2020, which wasn't there. So my concern is that in the best case scenario for Georgia or any other state, even if the bills that ultimately pass are not too bad, I'm concerned that it's going to negatively impact perceptions of the legitimacy of the electoral system, since it's been promulgated to address a problem that doesn't exist. And certainly for some communities is going to be seen as an attack on their voting rights. And the less legitimacy there is in the electoral system, the more likely some may conclude that non-electoral means are the way to solve their problems. And that's where we don't want to go as a country.
Right. Very complex, very thorny, and very pressing issue. I really appreciate you coming in and giving us your perspective and the Carter Center's perspective about what's coming and what we're after. And we're looking forward to hearing more results from your organization in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan.